Story number 1.
The first time I saw the girl in the window, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was late October, and I had just moved into a small rental house on the outskirts of town. The house was old, the kind with creaky floorboards and doors that stuck no matter how hard you pulled. The landlady, an elderly woman with tired eyes, handed me the keys with a warning. "That house has its memories," she said, almost apologetically. "Some people don't stay long." I laughed it off, assuming she meant the usual. Old pipes, drafty rooms, maybe a mouse or two. It wasn't until my second night that I understood what she meant. I was in the kitchen, unpacking the last of my dishes, when something made me glance toward the living room. The house had a large bay window facing the street, and in the reflection of the glass, I saw her, a young girl, standing behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. My breath came fast and shallow. I turned back to the window. She was still there, her small face pale, her dark hair hanging limp over her shoulders. She wasn't in the room with me. She was inside the glass itself, her hollow eyes staring through the reflection. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, and the noise seemed to break whatever spell had been holding me in place. When I looked again, she was gone. I told myself it was exhaustion. The stress of the move, the lateness of the hour, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The next few nights were restless. The house was never quiet. Floorboards creaked under unseen footsteps. Doors swayed slightly as if someone was pressing against them. But the worst was the window. Every night, as soon as darkness fell, I saw her reflection. Never moving. Never speaking. Just staring. I started keeping the curtains closed, but that didn't help. I'd hear soft knocks on the glass, always in sets of 3, and when I dared to peek, she'd be there, waiting. It wasn't until I mentioned it to my neighbor, Mr. Holloway, that I learned the house's history. "That old place," he said, shaking his head. "You don't know, do you?" I told him about the girl in the window. His face paled. "Her name was Lillian. She lived there with her father in the 1930s. Nice folks, by all accounts. But one winter, she went missing. People searched for weeks, but she was gone without a trace. Then, months later, they found her, inside the house." My stomach turned. "Where?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He hesitated before speaking. "Behind that big bay window. They say her father bricked her up in there, sealed her inside the walls." I felt cold all over. Why would he do that? No one knows for sure. Some say he went mad, others say she had taken ill and he couldn't bear to let her go. But ever since, people have seen her, always in the window. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in the living room, staring at the closed curtains, listening. The knock started at midnight. 3 soft taps. Then silence. 3 more. My hands were shaking. Slowly I reached for the curtain. I pulled it back an inch, and my breath caught in my throat. She was there, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her, in the reflection, a shadow loomed. Tall, gaunt, its face obscured, but I could feel its presence, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just watching. It was waiting. A chill spread down my spine as I realized something. She wasn't the one haunting me. She was trying to warn me. The shadow in the glass began to move, its long fingers pressing against the reflection as if trying to break through. My body was frozen in place, terror rooting me to the spot. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, the girl spoke. "Help me." The glass cracked. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was outside, standing in the cold, gasping for breath. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, the curtains fluttering through the broken window. I left that night and never went back. The landlady didn't seem surprised when I returned the keys the next morning. "Some people don't stay long," she murmured. I moved across town and tried to put it behind me, but sometimes late at night I still dream of the window. And in the reflection, she is always there, still waiting, still trapped, and I know deep down that the shadow is still with her, waiting for someone else to move in. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I never believed in ghosts until I moved into that house. It was a small, one-story home on the outskirts of town, set back from the road with an overgrown yard and a rusted swing set that swayed even when the air was still. The rent was cheap, too cheap for the area, but I was fresh out of college, broke, and not in a position to question a good deal. The first time I stepped inside, I felt it. A heaviness in the air, like walking into a room just after an argument. The place had been empty for months, according to the landlord, yet the air smelled faintly of something rotten, something old. I told myself it was just my imagination. The first few nights passed uneventfully. I worked late hours at a diner downtown, and by the time I got home, I was too tired to notice anything unusual. But then small things started happening. Doors creaking open on their own, the bathroom light flickering even after I changed the bulb. The faint sound of footsteps when I knew I was alone. It wasn't until the third week that I saw her. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something dripping. Half asleep, I got up, thinking I had left the sink running. But as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. She was standing at the end of the hall. A woman, barely visible in the dim light, her hair matted and wet, her dress clinging to her body as if she had just climbed out of a lake. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me. A cold wave of fear crashed over me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I could only stare, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The hallway was empty. The next morning, I convinced myself I had been dreaming, but deep down, I knew better. The dripping sound continued for weeks. I checked every faucet, every pipe, but I could never find the source. Some nights I woke up gasping, my sheets damp with sweat, convinced that she had been standing over me as I slept. One night I heard whispering. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then it grew louder, words I couldn't understand, voices overlapping, coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from inside the house itself. I covered my ears. I told myself I was losing my mind. And then the knocking started. 3 knocks, always at 3:15 a.m., always from inside the walls. I barely slept after that. Desperate for answers, I asked my neighbor, an older man named Tom, if he knew anything about the house. His expression darkened. "You should leave," he said. "Why?" He hesitated. "That house, it's got a history. There was a woman who lived there years ago, young, quiet. No one knew much about her. One day, she just disappeared." "What happened to her?" "They never found her. People said she must have left town, but there were stories about sounds in the house, about a woman in the hallway." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Did the police ever look into it?" I asked. Tom sighed. "They searched, but there was no sign of her. No body, no struggle, just gone." I wanted to believe it was just an old story, small town gossip meant to scare newcomers. But I knew what I had seen. That night, I was too afraid to turn off the lights. I sat in my bed, knees drawn to my chest, listening. The whispering came first, then the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks from inside the walls, then the dripping. Except this time, it wasn't coming from the sink. It was coming from the ceiling. My stomach turned. I forced myself to look up. Dark stains had begun to spread across the ceiling, thick and wet, dripping onto the floor. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding. The stains grew larger, the liquid dripping faster. And then, a crack. The ceiling split open, and she fell. A body, rotting, waterlogged, crashed onto the floor in front of me. Her eyes were open, lips parted as if she were trying to speak. A scream clawed its way up my throat, but before I could make a sound, she disappeared. The room was silent again. The ceiling was intact. The stains were gone. I left that night and never went back. The landlord never asked why I broke the lease. Tom never spoke about it again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The knocking, the whispering, the slow, steady drip of water. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I never told anyone about what happened that summer. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew no one would believe me. Even now, years later, I still wake up in the middle of the night convinced I hear it. The knocking. It started when I moved into the old farmhouse. The house had been empty for years. It sat on the edge of a quiet rural town, its paint peeling, windows clouded with dust. It wasn't my first choice, but I needed somewhere cheap to stay while I finished my research for grad school. The landlord, a man named Richard, seemed almost too eager to rent it out. "You'll be the first tenant in nearly 10 years, he said as he handed me the keys. The last folks left in a hurry. I asked him why, but he only shrugged. "You'll hear stories. Don't pay them any mind." The first few days were uneventful. The house was old, and it made old house noises. Pipes groaning, floorboards settling, the wind rattling the loose panes of glass. But then, on the 4th night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I sat up, my heart hammering. It was coming from the front door. I glanced at my phone, 3:12 a.m. For a long moment, I didn't move. My brain fought between logic and fear. No one in their right mind would be knocking at this hour. Not in a town this small, not at an isolated house like this. I forced myself out of bed, heart pounding, and crept toward the door. The floor groaned under my weight as I pressed my eye to the peephole. No one was there. I stood frozen, listening. The wind whispered through the trees, but other than that, silence. I double-checked the lock and went back to bed. The next night, it happened again. 3 knocks. 3:12 a.m. This time I was ready. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a flashlight and yanked the door open. The night was empty. The porch light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. My breath curled in the cold air. Nothing. I told myself it was some prank, some local kids messing with me. But the third night, the knocking came from inside the house. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, right outside my bedroom door. I shot up, my skin crawling. The room was completely dark except for the faint glow of my phone screen on the nightstand. I strained to hear past the sound of my own breathing. Knock, knock, knock. It was just on the other side of the door. I reached for my bedside lamp, but before my fingers could find the switch, the doorknob turned. I heard the metal click as it twisted, slow and steady, like someone was testing to see if it was locked. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen, my hands gripping the blanket so hard my knuckles ached. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The room was silent again. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went into town and asked around. Most people avoided the conversation, shaking their heads or changing the subject. But finally, an older woman at the grocery store hesitated when I mentioned the farmhouse. "You should leave," she said. "Why?" She glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. Then, in a hushed voice, she told me. Years ago, a man lived there with his wife and daughter. No one really knew them well. They kept to themselves. But one winter, the girl went missing. The father said she ran away, but people had their doubts. Some folks swore they heard knocking coming from inside the walls at night. A chill spread through my body. They never found her body, the woman continued. But the father, he hanged himself in the barn not long after. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. At 3:12 a.m., the knocking started. It came from inside the walls. 3 slow, muffled thuds. I sat up, every muscle in my body tense. The sound moved, traveling along the wall toward the closet. I held my breath as the knocking stopped, and then the closet door creaked open. Darkness yawned from within. I wanted to move, to run, but I couldn't. I could only watch as something shifted inside the closet. A shape small, hunched, barely visible in the dim light. And then I heard it. A voice, soft and hoarse, whispering from the darkness. "Help me." I don't remember what happened next. Maybe I passed out. Maybe I ran. The next thing I knew, it was morning, sunlight streaming through the window. The closet door was closed. I packed my things and left that day. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and for just a second, I saw her. A little girl, standing in the upstairs window, watching me leave. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I used to work night shifts at a small gas station off a lonely stretch of highway. It wasn't a bad job, boring most nights, but quiet. The kind of place where the most excitement was a lost traveler stopping in for coffee and directions. That all changed the night the woman came in. It was around 2:30 a.m. and I was alone as usual. The station had glass doors and I could see the empty highway stretching into the distance. A single flickering street lamp cast a pale glow over the parking lot. I was behind the counter when I saw her. She was standing just outside the glass doors. She hadn't walked up. I would have heard footsteps. She was just there. A thin woman in a long, old-fashioned dress, her dark hair hanging over her shoulders. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me, into the station. Something about her made my stomach turn. I forced myself to open the door a crack. "Ma'am, do you need help?" She didn't move, didn't even blink. The air felt heavy, thick, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. My gut screamed at me to shut the door, to lock it, to turn away. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, she spoke. "Where is my baby?" My skin went cold. I had no idea what to say. The way she asked, it wasn't frantic, wasn't desperate, it was hollow. like she already knew the answer. I stepped back, ready to close the door when she moved. She stepped forward, and for the first time, I saw her face clearly. Her eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep, like looking into something that wasn't meant to be seen. I slammed the door and locked it. She didn't react, just stood there, staring. Then, slowly, she lifted one hand and pressed it to the glass. Her fingers left behind a damp, smudged print. I backed away, grabbing my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed the police. By the time they arrived, she was gone. The only thing left was the handprint on the glass. The officers didn't seem too concerned. They took a quick look around and chalked it up to some confused woman wandering the highway. They offered to file a report, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. I didn't sleep that day. The next night, I almost convinced myself it had been a dream. But at exactly 2:30 a.m., I looked up, and she was there again, standing in the same spot, wearing the same dress. This time, I didn't open the door. I just stared as she lifted her hand and pressed it to the glass. But this time, when she pulled it away, something was different. There were more handprints, small ones, like a child's. I ran to the back room and stayed there until sunrise. I quit the next morning. A week later, out of morbid curiosity, I looked into the history of the highway. Years ago, before the station was built, there had been a house on that land. A house that burned down in the 1950s. The fire killed a woman and her child. The mother's body was found near the road. The child was never found. I don't drive that highway at night anymore, and I never stop for strangers on the road. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
I never liked my grandparents' house. It wasn't haunted in the dramatic sense, no flying objects or guttural whispers, but something about it was just off. A lingering discomfort, like walking into a room where someone had just been talking about you. The house was old, built in the early 1900s, with creaky wooden floors and tall, narrow hallways. My grandparents had lived there for over 50 years, and they insisted it was just a house, nothing more. But I knew better. It started when I was 8. I was staying over for the weekend, sleeping in the guest room at the end of the hall. Sometime during the night, I woke up to the sound of someone walking. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. I thought it was my grandfather getting up to use the bathroom, but when I peeked out, the hall was empty. The footsteps continued, moving toward my room. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the darkness outside my door. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside my door. I waited, frozen, expecting the handle to turn for someone to come in. But nothing happened. I barely slept after that. Over the years, I tried to brush it off. Old houses make noises, wood shifts, pipes settle. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the feeling never went away. And then, one night, it got worse. I was 15, staying over during the summer. I had grown used to the strange atmosphere, but something felt different that night. Heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I woke up around 2 a.m., heart pounding, and I wasn't sure why. The room was dark, except for the dim glow from the hallway nightlight. Everything was silent. And then I heard it. Breathing. Not mine. Someone else's. Shallow, raspy, coming from the foot of my bed. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. My body was frozen in place as the breathing grew louder, closer. Summoning every ounce of courage, I reached for my bedside lamp and switched it on. There was nothing there. But the closet door, it was open. Just a crack. I hadn't left it open. I told myself I was imagining things, that I had just forgotten to close it before bed. But deep down, I knew the truth. The next morning, I told my grandmother about it. She hesitated before giving me a small, tired smile. "The house is old," she said. "It remembers things." That was the first time she had ever acknowledged anything unusual. A few weeks later, I was back home when I got the call. My grandfather had passed away in his sleep. I went back for the funeral, and afterward, I stayed at the house to help my grandmother. That first night, I barely slept. The house felt empty, but not in the way you'd expect after someone passes. It was like something else was waiting. And then, at 2 a.m., I woke up. The air was thick, suffocating. I turned onto my side, facing the closet. The door was open again. And this time, I wasn't alone. A figure stood just inside the darkness. Tall, thin, unmoving. I couldn't see its face, just the outline. A silhouette darker than the shadows around it. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. Then, in the silence, it whispered, Not yet. I don't remember what happened next. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the window. The closet door was shut and everything looked normal, but I knew what I had seen. I left that day and never stayed overnight again. My grandmother passed 2 years later, and the house was sold to a new family. I don't know if they hear the footsteps at night. I don't know if they wake up to find the closet door open. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear the whisper. Not yet. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had always been skeptical about ghosts. That changed in the fall of 2019 when I moved into an old Victorian house in upstate New York. The house had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades before a local real estate investor bought it, restored it, and rented it out. It was cheap, spacious, and sat on the edge of a dense forest, perfect for someone like me who preferred solitude. From the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite define. The wooden floorboards groaned under my weight, and the house exhaled a deep sigh, as if relieved to have someone inside again. The first night, I barely slept. The silence of the house was absolute, save for the occasional creaks and whispers of old wood settling. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a faint sound, like someone was walking down the upstairs hallway. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. Was someone inside? Slowly, I got up, gripping the baseball bat I kept beside my bed, and inched toward the door. I held my breath, reached for the knob, and yanked it open. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Cold air rushed past me, and a shiver ran down my spine. I checked every room, every closet. Nothing was out of place. I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the old house settling. But it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. Lights flickered, even though the wiring had been redone. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft whispers, words I couldn't understand. Then I saw her. It was just past midnight, and I was reading in bed. I felt an inexplicable urge to look up, and there, standing just inside my open closet, was a woman. She was pale, her dark hair hanging in wet, tangled strands over her shoulders. Her dress, if it could even be called that, was little more than rotted fabric clinging to her frail frame. But it was her face that froze me in place. Hollow, sunken eyes stared at me, her mouth slightly open as if she was about to speak. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The room grew unbearably cold, my breath visible in the air. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I began researching the house, desperate for answers. I scoured local archives, old newspapers, anything that could give me a clue. That's when I found the story. The house had belonged to a woman named Eleanor Hastings in the late 1800s. According to town records, she had been engaged to a wealthy man, but he had disappeared just before their wedding. Heartbroken and alone, Eleanor had locked herself away in the house, refusing to speak to anyone. One winter, her body was found in an upstairs bedroom, dead from starvation. The townspeople claimed she had gone mad, believing her fiancé had never truly left, that he was still in the house, waiting for her. But the most chilling part? The room where she had died was my bedroom. I considered moving, but part of me felt like I needed to understand what was happening. Maybe she wasn't trying to hurt me. Maybe she just wanted to be seen. One night, I decided to acknowledge her. I sat on the edge of my bed, every light in the room turned off, waiting. At exactly 3 a.m., the temperature dropped. I felt a presence, something heavy pressing down on the air. And then she was there. I swallowed hard. My voice shook as I spoke. "Eleanor?" The whispering started again, but this time I could almost make out words. "Where is he?" I felt a chill race down my spine. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Her head tilted, and in the dim moonlight, I saw a tear roll down her cheek. "He said he would come back." Something about her voice, so full of sorrow, of longing, made my fear waver. I wasn't looking at an evil entity. She was a woman who had been waiting for someone who never returned. "I don't think he's coming back," I whispered. A long silence. Then she blinked slowly as if realization had just hit her. The air in the room grew lighter, the pressure lifting. Her form seemed to shimmer, growing fainter. Then she was gone. For the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. I don't know if Eleanor truly moved on that night or if she still lingers in the house, but after that, I never saw her again. The whispers stopped. The footsteps ceased. The house finally felt like...
Story number 7.
I never believed in ghosts until I lived with one. It started in the winter of 2018. I had just moved into a small rental house in upstate New York. It wasn't anything special, just a one-story, two-bedroom place on the outskirts of town. The landlord told me an older woman had lived there for decades before she passed away the previous spring. He was upfront about it, but I didn't think much of it at the time. People die in houses all the time. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. The house was quiet, and I was settling in. Then little things started happening. It was small at first. Misplaced objects, doors I was sure I had closed being open when I came back into the room. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just forgetful. Maybe the house settled in odd ways. But then, one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. It was just past 2 a.m. The house was dark except for the glow of the street lamp outside. My bedroom door was open slightly, and as I lay in bed, I could hear it. Soft, shuffling steps moving slowly down the hall. My heart pounded. I lived alone. I reached for my phone, barely breathing as I listened. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I sat up, waiting. Silence. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I imagined it, the floor creaked. Right inside my room. I turned on my bedside lamp in an instant, my heart racing. The room was empty. My door was still slightly open, the hallway beyond it dark and quiet. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the house really did creak like that when the temperature changed. Maybe I had dreamed the sound of footsteps. But that night I locked my bedroom door before going to bed. At exactly 2 a.m. I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was soft but deliberate. 3 slow knocks. I lay frozen, staring at the door. My breath felt heavy in my chest. Then, from the other side of the door, a whisper. "You don't belong here." I shot up, flipped on the light, and grabbed the nearest object I could use as a weapon, a heavy lamp from my nightstand. I stood there, shaking, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But after that whisper, there was only silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. Over the next few days, things escalated. The lights flickered constantly, even though the wiring was fine. I'd wake up to find my kitchen chairs pulled out from the table like someone had just been sitting there. My keys disappeared from the counter and turned up in the bathroom sink. Then, the shadows started. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes passing through doorways, shifting in corners where there was nothing to cast them. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I saw it in the mirror, a figure standing just outside the bathroom door. It was only there for a second, but I knew what I saw. A dark silhouette, tall and motionless, watching me. I turned, but nothing was there. I called my friend Jake the next morning. I hadn't told anyone what was happening because, honestly, I didn't want to sound crazy, but I needed someone else to be in that house with me, even just for a night. Jake showed up with a 6-pack and his usual confidence, convinced I was just scaring myself. That night, we stayed up late playing video games in the living room. I felt safer with someone else there. Nothing happened for hours, and I started to feel a little ridiculous. Then at 2 a.m., the temperature in the room dropped. Jake stopped mid-sentence. "Do you feel that?" he asked. I nodded, my breath visible in the air. A moment later, we heard it. 3 knocks from my bedroom. Jake laughed nervously. "Okay, that's weird." Then the bedroom door creaked open on its own. We stared, neither of us moving. The hallway beyond the door was pitch black. Then, from inside the room, came a whisper. "You don't belong here." Jake bolted for the front door. I was right behind him. We didn't stop running until we were in his car, half a block down the street. I moved out 2 days later. I don't know who or what was in that house. I never asked the landlord for details, never wanted to know what had really happened there, but sometimes late at night I still hear it in my dreams. 3 knocks and a whisper.
Story number 8.
I was never afraid of the dark until I lived in that house. In 2016, I moved to a small town in West Virginia for a new job. It was supposed to be temporary, just a year or 2 until I got enough experience to move somewhere bigger. I found a cheap rental, a 1-story house at the end of a long, winding road surrounded by woods. The place had been empty for a while, but the landlord assured me it was in good shape. The first few weeks were fine. The house was quiet, a little too quiet at times, but I liked the solitude. That changed one night in late October. I woke up at 2:47 a.m. to the sound of knocking, not on my front door, from inside the house. It was soft, rhythmic. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. It was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I held my breath, heart pounding, straining to hear anything else. But after a minute, the knocking stopped. I told myself I had imagined it, just the old house settling. But the next night at exactly 2:47 a.m., it happened again. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. This time I was fully awake, staring at my closed bedroom door. The sound was coming from right outside. I didn't sleep after that. Things escalated quickly. My belongings started moving on their own, my keys disappearing from the counter and turning up in the bathroom sink, cabinet doors standing open when I knew I had closed them. The worst was the shadows. I'd catch glimpses of them out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes moving along the walls, just beyond my vision. I told myself it was my imagination, tricks of the light. But one night, I saw it clearly. I had been in the kitchen rinsing a glass when I looked up and saw a figure standing at the edge of the hallway. It was tall, impossibly thin, and completely black, as if it absorbed the light around it. I froze. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I left the house that night and slept in my car. The next day, I called my landlord and asked about the house's history. At first, he was reluctant to say anything, but eventually he admitted that the last tenant, a man in his 50s, had died in the house. He had lived alone just like me, and one day his coworker found him sitting in his chair, eyes open, completely still. The cause of death was never determined. I moved out a week later. I don't know what was in that house, but I still dream about the knocking, always at 2:47 a.m., and sometimes in the darkness of my new apartment, I swear I hear it again. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. Story the end.
Story number 9.
When I was 19, I moved into a small apartment in the city. It was an old building, but it had charm. Exposed brick walls, hardwood floors, and large windows that let in sunlight all day. The rent was cheap, and the landlord was friendly, so I didn't think much about the place's age. I was just happy to have my own space after living with roommates during college. The first month went by without incident. Everything was normal. Until one night, a little after midnight, when I was lying in bed reading. The apartment was silent except for the sound of traffic outside. I had just finished a chapter when I heard it, a soft noise coming from the kitchen. It was a tapping sound. I put the book down and listened, trying to figure out what it was. The noise was faint but persistent, almost like someone tapping a spoon on the counter. I got up, half expecting to find a leaky faucet or something that had fallen off the counter. But when I walked into the kitchen, everything was in place. No broken dishes, no misplaced objects, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was the building settling, or maybe the noise had come from a neighbor's apartment. But the tapping continued. The next night it was louder, this time almost like a rhythmic knocking. 3 knocks, then a pause, and then 3 more. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stood in the kitchen, looking around, but there was no sign of anything unusual. The air felt strangely cold, even though the heater had been running. The knocking came again. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls, not just the kitchen. The knocks echoed through the apartment. I felt a chill run down my spine. That's when I decided to investigate. I went down to the basement where the building's utility room was. The landlord had told me that the pipes ran through the walls, but I didn't know if that could explain the knocking sounds. As I made my way down the dark, narrow hallway to the utility room, I felt a growing sense of unease. The air felt heavy. The utility room itself was cluttered with old furniture and boxes. The lights flickered as I walked in, making me feel even more uncomfortable. But there was nothing unusual, just a few old pipes, a furnace, and some random junk. Still, the knocking continued. I left the basement, life deciding that maybe the sound was just the building's old pipes expanding and contracting. But the next night, it was even worse. The knocking started again, but this time it was followed by something else, a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was talking just beyond the walls. The whispers were muffled, almost as if they were coming from the other side of a door. I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I was alone in the middle of the night, and there was no logical explanation for what was happening. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I called my friend Rachel, who lived a few blocks away. She had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but I didn't know who else to turn to. She came over, and we sat in the living room, trying to wait out the sounds. We were both silent, listening for any sign of the knocks or whispers. As the night dragged on, the tension between us grew thicker. Finally, just as we were about to give up, I heard it. The sound of something scraping against the floor just outside the door. Rachel looked at me, wide-eyed. "What was that?" I didn't have an answer. I grabbed a flashlight and we slowly crept toward the door. When I opened it, there was nothing. The apartment was completely still. But as I shone the flashlight on the floor, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a dark stain like something had been dragged across the floor. Rachel and I stared at it in disbelief. Neither of us had noticed it before. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. Something had been moved, something heavy, across the floor in the middle of the night. I was terrified. Rachel was too, but she tried to stay calm. "Let's go outside and wait for morning," she suggested. We stepped out into the cold night air, both of us shaken, and I felt a surge of relief when we were away from the apartment. It wasn't until later, when we were sitting on the stoop, that Rachel said something that made my heart stop. "Have you looked in the closet?" she asked. I froze. "What do you mean?" She looked at me. "The closet in your bedroom. I don't know why, but I keep getting this feeling something is in there." I hadn't thought about it. The closet door had always been closed. It was a small, narrow space, black, and I'd never really looked inside. We went back inside together, and I stood in front of the closet door, hesitant. The feeling of dread crept up on me again. I opened the door slowly, shining the flashlight inside. The beam of light landed on a large, old trunk, one I hadn't noticed before. It looked out of place, like it had been shoved back into the corner and forgotten about. I reached for the latch, feeling uneasy. Rachel was behind me, her breath held. When I opened it, the stench hit me first, a smell of damp earth, like something had been buried. And then I saw it. There was a small, tattered photo inside the trunk. It was an old black and white picture of a woman I didn't recognize, sitting on a chair in the middle of a dimly lit room. The woman's face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel her eyes on me, even in the faded picture. I pulled the photo out, shuddering. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down either. Rachel and I stared at it, and I felt a creeping sensation on the back of my neck. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. The flashlight flickered, and then the door slammed shut behind us. We jumped, both of us frozen in fear. I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. We were locked in. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, filling the air around us. And just as suddenly as it had started, the door flew open. Rachel and I ran out of the apartment, leaving everything behind. We didn't stop running until we were back at her place, several blocks away. The next morning, I went back to get my things. The apartment felt cold and empty, but everything was as I had left it. There was no trace of the trunk, no trace of the photo. It was like nothing had ever happened. I moved out that afternoon. I never spoke to my landlord again. I never looked back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the whispers, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I can see the face of the woman in the photo, her eyes watching me. I don't know what happened in that apartment, but I'll never go back. Story the end.